So our last presentation today is Dr. Myiah Hutchens. She's assistant professor at the University of Florida. Dr. Hutchens is closing out the day with a presentation on politics, and her title is Expletives and Improving Political Communication. Thank you so much, Dr. Hutchens, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tina. So thank you all for staying here and spending your afternoon with me. So I'm a political communication scholar, which for more than a decade now, I've been focusing on one particular type of communication. I specialize in what makes us seek out information that we disagree with, counter-attitudinal information or attitudinally challenging information or other ways that we talk about it. But why I care so much about this exposure to disagreeable information is from a theoretical perspective. It's super, super important for politics that we're going to make much better decisions when we are talking to a diverse range of individuals. That's going to make us more tolerant for others' views. That's going to make us more aware of why people believe the things that they do. And when we have that understanding, then we're much more likely to collaborate and be able to come up with solutions that everyone can get on board with. So what I want to talk about today is sort of highlight across a few different studies that I've done to talk about what our communication environment actually looks like, and what are particular things that we have to pay attention to when we're dealing with political communication or political information. And then from sort of a practical standpoint, for those of you who are either in charge of employees and have some sort of say over the political communication that happens in your environment, or you just as a citizen want to know how you can engage in political conversation in a better way, to give you some tips to talk about how can we deal with this communication in a beneficial way. So to start off, one of the biggest things that we're often worried about when we're thinking about communication and exposure to disagreeable views is actually that we don't do it at all. So this is something that probably many of you are familiar with the ideas of filter bubbles and echo chambers. And so what these are is essentially different ways of creating an environment that you are surrounded by like-minded views. So this happens through selective exposure, which is something that we know we do. There's a lot of evidence that we are going to select information that is agreeable to us, that's consistent with what we already think. So a filter bubble occurs if an algorithm then is helping us create this environment that is entirely attitudinally consistent. So on any social media platform, we know that algorithms are designed to encourage us to stay using that platform for longer. And so a filter bubble occurs when that platform then, through its algorithms, just feeds you more and more of the same content, and that content is attitudinally consistent. An echo chamber is going to be if you're doing it yourself. So if through your media choices, through blocking or muting people on social media, you are engaging in conversation that is entirely attitude consistent. So people are just telling you what you already think, right? A key problem with this in the United States is something called affective polarization. And this is something that we know has been getting worse over the years. So affective polarization deals with the idea that there's a growing gap between how much we like our own group and how much we dislike the other group. So it has nothing to do with us actually having different political opinions, but it's really about disliking the other. And this is something that we have a lot of evidence for it being something that's gotten worse over time. So if you look at the top line on that chart there that I'm showing you, that's how much we like our own party. So over time, rate your own political party. How warm do you feel towards it? And you can see over time, it really hasn't changed. Both Democrats and Republicans like their party, and we like it about the same. What's different, though, are those bottom two lines, and that's how warm you feel towards the other party. And we can see that that's been decreasing consistently. And so over time, what's happening is this growing gap between how much we dislike the other. And when that happens, then we're going to have a hard time coming up with policies. We're going to have a hard time talking to each other. And that can be detrimental from sort of a democratic perspective. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how we choose to talk to people. So creating our own sort of discussion networks, right? So who in an average day are you talking to most? And so also, what is the proportion of people that you're talking to that are like you versus unlike you? And we have theory that would tell us that this is going to be related to affective polarization, that the more we're talking to people like us, the more likely we are going to be affectively polarized and to have that grow. So I wanted to look at that over time. And so to do that, I use something called a reinforcing spirals model. And so what that does is it allows us to see over time, how is our communication and an attitude, behavior, or belief related to each other over time? And so do they actually reinforce each other over time? Does one actually cause the other? So in this case, would we see a polarization spiral where the more we're talking to people who are like us, the more likely we are to be polarized? It could be that we're wrong and we actually see a depolarization spiral, so that the more we're talking to people like us, that actually reduces our polarization. Or we could see something called homeostasis. And so what that means essentially is our communication patterns are set, our polarization levels are set, and it doesn't really change over time. And so I've looked at this during two different presidential elections, both the 2012 and the 2016 election. My 2020 data is still not done being collected. But across both 2012 and 2016, I saw the exact same pattern, that individuals who are talking to people who are like them more are more polarized at the beginning of the campaign. So I'm following these same people at 3 different time points during the campaign. And we see at the beginning of the campaign, if I'm talking to a higher proportion of people like me, I'm more polarized. And both of these things sort of reinforce themselves over time, that I continue to talk to more people like me throughout the campaign, and that my polarization sort of grows throughout the campaign. But importantly, what I'm seeing is that triangle in the middle there, that individuals who are more polarized at the beginning of the campaign then are more likely to talk to people who are like themselves, which then reinforces affective polarization. And so this is something that's problematic, right, from a democratic perspective, that we're seeing that talking to people, so typically our close ties, is going to be reinforcing this dislike of the other. But like I said, what I'm really interested in is talking to people who are unlike me, right? So we know that we don't exist in perfect echo chambers, right? So this idea that you can perfectly wall yourself off from counter-attitudinal views doesn't really happen. So what does, right? And are there different ways that we can think about this communication that might have better outcomes? So we do see some counter-attitudinal information, right? We definitely have a preference for consistent information, right? When we look at our media source choices, if we give people forced choice, which one do you want to listen to or watch, people choose the source that is attitudinally consistent. If we look at where we work or where we live, we tend to live and work with people who are like us. So this is something that is definitely there. However, when we're looking at our media use, what's more common actually are news junkies, which all of us on this call, I'm going to guess, actually fall into that category, which is people who use one type of media also tend to use others, right? And so what we actually see is the creation of these news junkies, people who are using a lot of different sources. Maybe you're looking at the other source to sort of denigrate it, perhaps, but you are seeking a variety of sources. And so what we're seeing is a bigger gap in our media use is the difference between these junkies and complete news avoiders, rather than differences between junkies and people who are just using a single attitudinally consistent source. If we're looking at our discussion networks consistently, and again, I've been doing this research for over a decade now, on average, only about 10% of people say that they never talk about politics with people that they disagree with. And a big portion of that 10% are actually people who don't talk about politics at all. So we know that there is some information out there, and we are engaging with this information that would give us different perspectives. So where are we most likely to see this information? There's some evidence that we're actually more willing to engage in counter-attitudinal information in online or mediated contexts than in face-to-face settings, right? So I'm willing to go online and read a news article from a source that I don't agree with. Or as I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed, I'm seeing posts from people who are saying things that I wouldn't agree with. Or even I'll turn on the TV and go to a channel that's maybe counter-attitudinal, because that's viewed as sort of more safe. As I'm processing that information, I can see that information and think about it and not have to actually deal with it, right? Where in a face-to-face setting, so I have an uncle that has a completely polar opposite view of me. If I call my Uncle Jerry and talk to him, then all of the sort of relationship norms that are part of that then become something that I have to deal with. I have to deal with him teasing me and all of these other things. And so we see that people are more likely to actually engage in online situations than face-to-face. If we do it in face-to-face situations, it tends to be much more superficial. What we're worried about in mediated contexts is this idea that a lot of times this disagreement in mediated or online settings can happen in a civil manner, or it can happen uncivilly, right? And so civil typically tends to be what happens in these face-to-face settings, right? Where I'm going to be nice to my uncle, and we're going to deal with these politeness norms and everything about sort of our relationship that would influence that. Versus online, it tends to happen in a much more sort of uncivil way, right? And typically, what we're thinking about is flaming when we're thinking about this type of interaction, so that what happens in online context sometimes is that we are hidden behind a screen, we're engaging with people that we really don't know, and so if we are experiencing that disagreement, we might not be doing it sort of in the best way, right? But a lot of what we do is social media, scanning, right? Online news use is growing. We know a lot of people are using social media for news. And so we have this question of, to what extent is polarization actually being driven by our social media news use? Are filter bubbles, in this case, sort of to blame? Are we seeing that actually happening in these online settings? And so using that same reinforcing spirals model, looking at how our social media news use is related to our polarization, I find something a little bit different in comparison to when we're looking at who we're talking to. So at first it looks really similar, right? People who are spending time on social media for news are more polarized than people who don't spend time on social media for news. And we also see that this reinforces itself throughout the election. So if I'm polarized at the beginning of the campaign, I'm even more polarized at the end of the campaign. If I'm using a lot of social media at the beginning, I'm using more at the end. But that's where my similarities stop, right? I do not see a polarization effect with social media news use and affective polarization. So there's no relationship between using social media, increasing my polarization and therefore increasing my news media use. In fact, what I see is actually the opposite. I see a depolarizing effect, that individuals who are effectively polarized are actually decreasing their use of Facebook over the time of the election, and Facebook use is actually associated with a decrease in affective polarization. And so I proposed and then found that this is actually due to exposure to counter-attitudinal information, right? So using Facebook earlier in the election was unrelated to an increase in exposure to attitudinally consistent information, but it was associated with an increase in exposure to counter-attitudinal information. And that exposure to counter-attitudinal information actually decreased my affective polarization by the end of the campaign. And so, you know, full disclosure, I am an eternal optimist, right? And so I interpret this data in a pretty optimistic way. And so what I'm seeing from this is actually that Facebook doesn't appear to be facilitating seek a lot of attitude consistent information, but our Facebook use is not preventing us from engaging in counter-attitudinal news on social media. Instead, what I'm seeing is when we look over time on social media is actually associated with depolarizing effects. And this is because of increased exposure to counter-attitudinal news sources. But so we still have to sort of deal with these conflicting findings where I'm saying who I'm talking to is increasing my polarization. What I'm seeing on social media, not so much. But we talk to people online. So what happens when we talk to people online? And can we do that in a way that is sort of democratically beneficial? A huge issue with sort of anything that we're talking about with politics is group identification. So social identity is huge when we're talking about our political beliefs and how we engage with others. And this is something that we know from a variety of contexts. We are really, really good as humans at figuring out who is part of our in-group and who is part of our out-group. And we respond differently when members of our in-group or our out-group do the exact same behavior. The classic example of this is standing in line. And so if I'm bumped while standing in line and I turn around and look at someone from my in-group, then I think it was an accident, right? I attribute sort of good or neutral motives to that. However, if I turn around and I see that it's someone of my out group, right? So I'm University of Florida. I turn around in the before times, I'm waiting to get into a football game, and I saw it was a Georgia person or a Florida State person. I now am going to attribute negative intentions, right? I'm going to say that they were doing it to be mean, or it was purposeful, or something like that. And so thinking about how can we use group identification in these online contexts to change how we respond to individuals is going to be important. Another thing that's really important when we're thinking about trying to change people's behavior is this idea of modeling. So modeling is something that we know is how we learn from mediated others, right? So if I'm seeing someone who is like me getting rewarded for a behavior, then I'm much more likely to do it. Where if I see someone who is like me being punished for a behavior, then I am much less likely to do it. And if we think about how online communication is set up, there are rewards and punishments built in all over the place, right? So the comments, the likes, the hearts on your Facebook, those are all subtle rewards for what you're doing. If you're a fan of Reddit, then the downvote, right? Or a comment saying what you're doing is inappropriate is going to be a punishment in that setting. And so what I wanted to look at here was, does it matter if we reward or punish uncivil disagreement? So when we are disagreeing with someone in a impolite way, right, where we're just yelling rather than actually talking to each other. And in particular, could punishing bad behavior actually make people more willing to engage in politics and talk about politics, and actually have a more positive view of their outgroup members? So to do this, what I did was an experiment where I manipulated group identity and then also that whether or not you were being rewarded or punishment. So to manipulate group identity, I used usernames. So pre-tested usernames to see are they, to make a set that was viewed as more liberal and a set that's more conservative. So on the left here, you're seeing the conservative usernames. On the right are the liberal usernames. And then so then it would be match you up to, are you seeing your in-group or your out-group? And then I manipulated the norm. So are you being rewarded or punished through two different ways? So through the thumbs up or thumbs down. So are you being downvoted or upvoted? And then reinforced through comments on the post. So are other in-group members saying this is not okay? Again, on the left there is the punishment condition, and on the right is the reward. So where people are saying, hey, that's a great thing. And so what I find is what happens to your outgroup matters not at all. We do not care at all if outgroup members are rewarded or punished. That does not influence how we think of other groups. That does not influence whether or not we're going to engage in politics in the future. What does matter, though, is if our in-group is punished. So if people in your in-group are told, hey, stop being a jerk, that actually matters, and that actually increases your tolerance for outgroup members, and it actually then increases your intention to engage in politics and engage in discussion with other outgroup members in the future. So in general, what we can get from this is that what your in-group does matters. So calling out an outgroup member is not going to be persuasive to them in the slightest, right? It literally no effect. However, talking to your in-group members and trying to correct your in-group members and create a more deliberative environment does actually work. And so disagreement, exposure to disagreement does have positive effects. So this of talking to others and engaging in disagreement is not horrible for democracy, but in fact can be good, actually is supported, right? That we can see good things happening when we're engaging in political disagreement. But how we respond to incivility, we expect to see in that situation is really going to matter. So what do I want you to do? Right? So if you are someone that is thinking, hey, I would like to engage in better political discussions or have sort of better interactions with outgroup members, what are things that we can do as individuals to try to make this better? Call out your own side, right? When you see someone spreading misinformation, if you see someone behaving inappropriately in online contexts, especially if it is obvious that you are part of their in-group, call them out, right? That matters more. It may not matter for that individual that you are calling out, but those who are observing it, it does matter to them. And that's going to be much more successful than going after people who are not like you. It's also really, really important to remember that identities are multifaceted, right? So I have my political identity, but I also have my identity as a professor. I have my identity as a foodie and a home brewer and all of these other things. And so if we are disagreeing politically, but you can point out that we have a shared identity in another way to remind ourselves that we are actually more similar to each other than we are different, then that's typically going to result in a better conversation, right? That political identity is always going to be salient, but the more we can point out similarities across other contexts is going to be helpful. And also, please listen if you are engaging in conversation. And this is something that we talk about a lot in online contexts. If any of you have ever spent time in a comment section, you see that a lot of the times when disagreements happen, what happens are people are talking past each other. They are not actually talking to each other. People are waiting for their turn to speak and really not engaging with the other person at all. So listen, right? Acknowledge what the other person is saying, make them feel heard, and that tends to lead to a much more discussion if that is something that you're interested in doing. And the final thing that I would ask you to do is to really challenge yourself to seek out diverse perspectives. That, you know, the more you can, especially if you have control over what other people see, right? Making sure that you're using a variety of sources, that you're talking to my Uncle Jerry, right? Even if he's going to make fun of me, I'm still going to do that and try to encourage and engage in that type of conversation. So thank you very much for letting me wrap up your afternoon today. I'm happy to share with you any of the primary research that I've discussed. Just send me an email. I'm sure it's all behind journal paywalls, so you may or may not have access to it. But I'm a stats geek at heart, and I'm happy to get into the stats weeds with any of you as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Hutchens. And we're more than happy to share any of the research that you have as a follow-up to people as well. So I do have a couple questions. If you can just, since we're running out of time, maybe keep it to about 30 seconds. So one of them is, did you just study Facebook, or did you look at other social media platforms and whether people decrease usage around the period of time?
So I looked at other social media platforms as well. Facebook and Twitter in that study. I have more in 2020. But Facebook is by far used significantly more than any other platform. And that also tends to have the most diverse user group, where Twitter is really pretty liberal dominated. It's very much like academics and journalists. And so it has a much smaller percentage. And so we did a nationally representative sample, and so our average user said they did not use Twitter, right? They were between never and like once a year sort of deal. And so we didn't see effects for those outlets.
What about some of the new outlets that people sort of left when they said there was disinformation on Facebook and going to like Parler and Myiah or whatever?
Right. No, Parler is absolutely, like, that is, in 4 years, I will come back and I will tell you about Parler, right? Because that is what we see, you know, the switch to, especially sort of the conservative switch. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in 4 years. Was that sort of temporary, that people just, you know, had a huff and went over to Parler and they're just going to come back to Facebook? Or is that actually consequential and we're going to end up with sort of liberal and conservative echo chambers? Right now, you know, we don't know. And most of what we're talking about is more anecdotal evidence. So there definitely was an increase in people signing up for Parler. How much they're still using it, we don't know though.
Okay, great. Okay, so last question. We've actually, a lot of people have asked questions that are all really good, so I apologize that I can't get to all of them. Any studies on some autocratic governments like China and Russia who may even intentionally have media restrictions and putting people in their own echo chambers? What are your thoughts about this?
I'm primarily an Americanist, so I've dealt mostly with the American system. Usually when we're autocratic government has a totally different system, right? Especially if we're thinking about like China. So the extent to which people can use WeChat, and then it's like you have to talk in code in order to be able to do things, right? It's a totally sort of different beast. And so not my area of expertise, but people have looked at it for sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hutchens. We really appreciate you being here and for joining us this afternoon and closing us out. So thank you all for attending this session of the IPR Research Symposium. We're really sad we couldn't be in person, but it was really great that we have people from all over the world who joined in to hear about the research. Thanks also to the IPR team for all their great work in putting this together. And thanks to our amazing IPR Board of Trustees for all their support and the work that we do. The playbacks for each presentation will be sent probably this week, next week. And we will send some of the research and citations that people gave along with that, including, for example, Dr. Seavey's the racial guide for restaurants. And for more research, please visit our robust research library on our website, and we will also share any links posted from this event. IPR is also starting a monthly series in 2021. It's about 2 hours a month on the most critical topics of the profession. It will be both presentation along with a workshop, so stay tuned for that. And we have a lot of great studies coming out in January as well on the future of work in Asia, looking at the structure of corporate functions. So please stay tuned for that. Last but not least, I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. Stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person in 2021. Have a good day.